In this video, we'll learn about the major schools of thought throughout the history of the field of psychology. As our knowledge has developed, different prevailing frameworks have risen and fallen over the years. This represents the continual process of the scientific method. As I talk about each school of thought, think about the empirical evidence that supports that school of thought. Many of the ways of thinking that we consider outdated lacked the scientific evidence to support their theories and have fallen out of favor in modern times. Psychology started as more of a philosophical study, but in the 1800s we see a gradual shift towards using scientific methods. The first school of thought I'd like to talk about is called structuralism. This is the way that early psychologists tried to identify the basic parts or structures of the conscious mind. One of the main structuralist psychologists, and considered to be the founder of modern experimental psychology, is a guy named Wilhelm Wundt. He started the first psychology lab that we know of in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. He was famous for pioneering the use of reaction times, an objective measure of behavior. He also pioneered the use of introspection being a systematic way to examine one's mental experience. Another famous structuralist is named Edward Titchener. He took introspection in a different direction and expanded it. He sought to analyze the basic underlying components of a conscious experience. An example would be the perception of a musical tone. It could be classified based on its quality, its intensity, its duration, its clarity, and other components. And so he really tried to systematize this idea of introspection. However, introspection turns out to be not very reliable, so the field moved on. The next school of thought in our psychology timeline is functionalism. This is when psychologists sought to describe how the conscious mind aids adaptation to an environment. William James, a famous functionalist, said that the mind was too complex to be broken down into its basic elements. He went against structuralism. He said the mind is continually changing, and he coined the term stream of consciousness, this continuous stream of thoughts. He said that structuralism was like trying to understand building a house by studying each brick individually. He said, rather than studying the individual components, it's important to study the adapted purpose or function of the mind and behaviors. His main book he wrote was in 1890, and he started into psychological thought in about 1875. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of women in this story, and equally unfortunately, no non-white voices. But I want to mention Mary Whiton Calkins. She was a very important psychologist who was trained by James and extended his theories on functionalism. She eventually went on to become the president of the American Psychological Association, or the APA, in 1905. Charles Darwin, who many of you would consider to be a biologist, also furthered psychological functionalism. He formalized his evolutionary theory to describe the adaptive change in the characteristics of a population of organisms over time from generation to generation. But this theory also applied to mental activity and behavior, not just the physical characteristics that we might be familiar with, like beak morphology of the finches on the Galapagos Islands. So we can look at the brain and behavior as the ever-changing result of millions of years of evolution in action. Next, we'll talk about psychoanalytic theory. This is the attempt of psychologists to understand how unconscious thoughts cause psychological disorders. Now, the most famous psychoanalyst would be Sigmund Freud, who you might have heard of. He was all about the mental processes that operate below the level of conscious awareness. He considered the unconscious, which was often to be sexual and in conflict, the root cause leading to psychological discomfort or disorders. So he developed techniques of psychoanalysis to reveal this unconscious and make it conscious. Free association was one technique where individuals were asked to talk about whatever they wanted for as long as they wanted. Dream interpretation was another. Sigmund Freud was an important public figure for psychology. He brought a wider awareness to the field based on his work, but his views mostly are not really accepted by modern psychologists. The unconscious that he described can't really be tested empirically. Also, how do you really test the meaning of a dream, for example? Next, we'll talk about the Gestalt movement. Now we're into the early 1900s. This school of thought looked at the study of subjective perceptions as a unified whole. Pioneer of this school of thought was Max Wertheimer, whose work in 1912 formalized the Gestalt movement. He argued that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And so, for example, if I draw 3 lines here, you would see them as a triangle rather than just 3 lines. Wolfgang Kohler extended this area of psychology as well. Next, we have behaviorism. This is when psychologists began to describe behavior in response to environmental stimuli. John B. Watson was a proponent of this school of thought, with his preeminent work appearing in 1913, so around the same time as the Gestalt movement. He tried to make this business of psychology more scientific. He said that we should stop trying to study mental events that can't be observed, so he pushed a real empirical approach. He emphasized the environmental effects on observable behavior, and in the nature versus nurture debate, he was firmly in the nurture camp. He was all about the experiences and interactions a person has with the environment. B.F. Skinner extended behavioralism as a psychologist. He said that mental states could be used as observable behaviors, so what was happening under the skin could be observed externally. And he formalized the concept of operant conditioning, which we'll talk about later on in the semester. This emphasis on behaviorism lasted until the 1960s, but now we think that a strict behaviorist approach ignores the influence of thought processes in behavioral outputs. Our next step in the psychology timeline is the area of humanistic psychology. These psychologists sought to investigate how people become happier and more fulfilled. They focused on the basic goodness of people. Abraham Maslow is a prominent humanist, and he said that people are free to choose activities that make them happy and bring them fulfillment. So behaviors aren't just driven by unconscious thought or environmental stimuli. Another famous psychologist that's considered a humanist is Carl Rogers, and we'll hear his name again later in the semester. Humanist psychology led to the positive psychology movement, which emphasizes a focus on positive life aspects. And our last school of thought in psychology that we'll talk about in this video is cognitivism. This is the exploration of internal mental processes as they influence behavior. This is where we really focus on empirical evidence. So we have evidence that can't be explained by these earlier schools of thought. For example, observational learning. Animals can learn to do a task by watching another conspecific do that task. This is not explained by behaviorism. There are other things that are not explained by behaviorism, including the development of grammar, the changing interpretations of the world by children as they develop and age, and the cultural influences of what aspects of a story are remembered. Depending on your cultural background, people will remember details, themes, emotions differently when hearing the same story. George Miller is an early cognitivist, sort of published his prominent work in 1957. He looked at the evidence, some of which I just described, and he switched from his earlier behaviorist perspective to argue for this emphasis on the mental processes and their role in behavior output. Ulrich Neisser published his main work in 1967, took cognitivism a step further, embracing the mind's role in driving behavior. All of this work led to the field of cognitive neuroscience, which was basically an integrated view of the mind and the brain, which brought together several different disciplines, including psychology, neuroscience, computer science, and philosophy. And today, we have emerging technologies that are advancing our psychological understanding even further. For example, we have advanced brain imaging techniques, advanced methods in brain chemistry analysis, and also genetic analyses and genetic manipulation that have allowed us to actually control different aspects of brain function at a molecular level.